Dr. Robert Carter's weathered hands froze mid-delivery, his 72 years of veterinary experience crumbling in an instant as he stared at what emerged from Max's womb. It wasn't a puppy. The German Shepherd's final push brought forth something that defied every law of nature Bob had sworn to uphold. Sarah's coffee mug shattered against the clinic floor, the crash echoing through the stunned silence as she stumbled backward, her veterinary textbooks suddenly meaningless. Max whimpered softly, nuzzling the impossible creature with the same tender love she'd shown her 3 normal puppies. Bob's mind raced to his late wife Margaret's final words about Max being special, to the mysterious treatments, to Sarah's nervous phone calls she thought he hadn't noticed. The pieces formed a picture too horrifying to accept. "Get the phone," Bob whispered, his voice barely audible over his thundering heartbeat, though every instinct screamed this was beyond any emergency protocol. What had they done to his boy? And how long did they have before someone came looking? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, Dr. Robert Carter had believed his biggest worry was whether to sell the family ranch or watch his savings disappear into Max's medical bills. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows of his Helena, Montana home, casting long shadows across the breakfast table where he sat with his granddaughter Sarah, her auburn hair catching the light, just like her grandmother Margaret's used to. "Uncle Bob, you can't keep spending your pension on Max's treatments," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm, as she reviewed the veterinary bills scattered across the worn oak table. At 28, she carried herself with the determined grace of someone who'd learned early that life didn't hand out second chances. Her veterinary school debt of $180,000 hung between them like an unspoken weight, though Bob pretended not to notice how thin she'd grown or how her hands shook slightly when she thought no one was looking. Max lay contentedly at Bob's feet, his massive German Shepherd frame a reassuring presence that had anchored Bob's world since Margaret's death 2 years ago. The dog's intelligent brown eyes tracked every movement, every conversation, with the devotion that had earned him a permanent place at the family dinner table. "That dog's got more sense than most people I've met," Bob often said, and he meant every word. The Carter Ranch stretched across 300 acres of Montana countryside, a legacy passed down through 3 generations of veterinarians who'd served the rural community with unwavering dedication. Bob's grandfather had built the main house in 1924, his father had added the veterinary clinic in 1952, and Bob himself had modernized it in 1978, when he'd returned from Vietnam with shrapnel in his leg and nightmares that only Max seemed able to chase away. "Your grandmother would tell me to fight for what matters," Bob said, scratching behind Max's ears with the practiced motion of a man who'd found his anchor. The dog's tail thumped against the hardwood floor, a sound that had become Bob's favorite morning symphony. "And this old boy matters more than money." Sarah's phone buzzed insistently on the table, displaying the same block number that had been calling for weeks. She quickly declined the call, but not before Bob noticed the flash of anxiety across her features. "Debt collectors again?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Just some pharmaceutical company," Sarah replied, avoiding his eyes. "They've been calling about some research opportunity. Nothing important." But Bob's military instincts, honed during 2 tours in Vietnam, caught the lie. He'd raised Sarah since she was 16, after her parents died in a car accident, and he knew when his granddaughter was hiding something. The question was whether it was pride keeping her from asking for help or something darker. As if sensing the tension, Max rose and padded over to Sarah, resting his massive head on her lap with the intuitive comfort that had made him legendary among Bob's former patients. Whatever storm was coming, they'd face it together, just like they always had. 2 weeks after that conversation, the call came that would change everything. Bob was feeding the chickens behind the house when Sarah burst through the screen door, her face pale but eyes bright with desperate hope. "Uncle Bob, I found someone who can help Max." Dr. James Wellington arrived at the ranch the following Tuesday in a pristine white SUV that looked out of place against the weathered barn and pasture fencing. He was younger than Bob had expected, maybe 45, with the kind of confident smile that pharmaceutical salesmen wore when they wanted something. His handshake was firm, professional, but his eyes kept scanning the property with an intensity that made Bob's old soldier instincts prickle. "Dr. Carter, your granddaughter tells me you have a very special German shepherd," Wellington said, kneeling beside Max with practiced ease. The dog allowed the examination but remained alert, his ears perked forward in a way that Bob recognized as cautious assessment. "I represent a private research foundation that's developing breakthrough treatments for canine cancer." Bob watched Wellington's hands move over Max's frame, noting how the younger veterinarian lingered over certain areas, almost mapping the dog's physique. "What kind of research?" Bob asked, crossing his arms over his chest. "Genetic therapy," Wellington replied smoothly. "We've had remarkable success with German Shepherds specifically. Their genetic markers respond exceptionally well to our protocol." He stood, brushing dirt from his expensive khakis. "The treatment would be completely free, and I can guarantee Max would be monitored by our best specialists." Sarah stepped closer to Bob, her voice urgent. "Dr. Wellington says Max could live another 10 years with this treatment, maybe longer." She placed her hand on Bob's arm, and he felt the slight tremor in her fingers. "Uncle Bob, it's his only chance." That evening, after Wellington had left with promises to return with the treatment protocol, Bob sat on the front porch with Max beside him, watching the sun set over the mountains that had framed his entire life. The dog's breathing was labored, and Bob could feel the tumor's presence like a shadow between them. Every day, Max grew a little weaker. Every morning, it took him longer to rise from his bed by the fireplace. "What do you think, old boy?" Bob asked, running his fingers through Max's thick coat. "Something doesn't smell right about that fancy doctor, does it?" Max's brown eyes reflected the dying light, and for a moment, Bob could swear he saw understanding there, even agreement. But then Sarah appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm kitchen light, and Bob saw his late wife Margaret in the curve of her shoulders, the tilt of her head. "The papers are ready for you to sign," Sarah said softly. "Doctor Wellington needs them by tomorrow morning." Bob studied his granddaughter's face in the porch light. Something flickered there, relief, guilt, desperation. Before he could analyze it further, she turned and disappeared back into the house. The screen door's gentle slap reminded him of Margaret's last summer, when she'd spent hours on this same porch, watching the world with eyes that already seemed to be seeing beyond it. The next morning, Wellington returned with a team of 3 assistants and enough medical equipment to stock a small hospital. They set up in Bob's old clinic, the space he'd converted to a workshop after retiring 5 years ago. The familiar smell of antiseptic filled the air as they prepared for Max's first treatment. "The initial injection will be substantial," Wellington explained, preparing a syringe that seemed unusually large. "We're introducing new genetic material that will essentially reprogram Max's immune system to attack the cancer cells." Bob held Max's head gently as the needle went in, whispering the same reassurances he'd given to thousands of animals over 5 decades of practice. "Easy, boy. Good dog. We're gonna fix you up." But even as he spoke the words, something cold settled in his stomach. Max's eyes found his, and in them Bob saw not the usual trust, but something that looked almost like resignation. The injection site swelled immediately, more than Bob had ever seen from any vaccine or medication. Wellington seemed pleased, making notes on a tablet while his assistants monitored Max's vital signs with equipment Bob didn't recognize. "Excellent response," Wellington murmured. "His cellular structure is adapting perfectly." As they packed up their equipment, Wellington handed Sarah an envelope. "The first installment," he said quietly, but not quietly enough. Bob caught the exchange, saw the relief flood Sarah's face as she quickly tucked the envelope into her jacket pocket. That night, Max refused his dinner for the first time in 8 years. He lay by Bob's chair, panting softly, his body radiating heat that seemed wrong somehow. Bob knelt beside him, placing his hand on the dog's flank, and felt something that made his blood run cold. Under Max's skin, something was moving. 6 weeks after the first treatment, Bob couldn't ignore the changes anymore. Max had not only recovered from his cancer, he'd transformed into something that defied everything Bob understood about canine physiology. The dog now stood nearly 4 inches taller. His muscles had doubled in mass, and his eyes held an intelligence that sent chills down Bob's spine. When Max looked at him now, it felt like being studied by something far more complex than any animal should be. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning when Bob found Wellington's briefcase left behind in the clinic. His hands shook as he opened it, revealing files that made his stomach lurch. Project Cerberus, Enhanced Canine Soldier Program, Subject 23, Max Carter. The photographs inside showed dozens of dogs in various stages of what the documents called genetic enhancement. Most were dead. The few survivors looked nothing like the animals they'd once been. Bob's legs gave out as he read further. Max hadn't been sick at all. The cancer had been induced through targeted injections during routine visits to a veterinary clinic in Billings, visits Sarah had arranged. The entire illness had been fabricated to create a desperate situation where Bob would accept any treatment, no questions asked. The worst revelation came in Sarah's file. Payment records showed $50,000 transferred to her account the day she'd first contacted Wellington. Additional payments of $25,000 each time she'd convinced Bob to continue the treatments. Her student debt, her desperate phone calls, her trembling hands, it all made horrifying sense now. Bob heard footsteps on the clinic's wooden floor and quickly shoved the papers back into the briefcase. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face brightening when she saw him. "Uncle Bob, you shouldn't be out here alone. Max has been looking for you." "Has he?" Bob's voice came out rougher than intended. He studied his granddaughter's face, searching for the girl he'd raised, the one who used to sneak table scraps to stray cats and cried when cartoon animals got hurt. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of panic quickly suppressed. "Of course, what is it?" "How did you really find Dr. Wellington?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Sarah's hands fidgeted with the hem of her jacket, the same nervous gesture she'd had since childhood when caught in a lie. "I told you. I researched treatment options online and—" "Stop." Bob's voice carried the authority of a man who'd commanded respect in 2 wars and 50 years of practice. "Your grandmother always said that lying was the one sin that poisoned everything it touched. I won't ask again." Sarah's composure crumbled. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she collapsed into the old examination chair. "They approached me 6 months ago. The debt collectors had started calling the school, threatening to kick me out. I was going to lose everything, Uncle Bob. Everything Grandma Margaret wanted for me." Bob felt his heart breaking, but forced himself to listen as the whole truth spilled out. Wellington's company had been monitoring veterinary students with significant debt, looking for leverage. They'd identified Sarah through financial records, then orchestrated Max's illness through a collaborating clinic during what Sarah thought was routine care. "They said it would just make him stronger," Sarah sobbed. They said the treatment would cure any cancer he might get naturally, that I'd be giving him a longer life. They made it sound like I was saving him. And the money? Bob's voice was barely a whisper. They said you'd never have to worry about his medical bills again, that you could keep the ranch, that I could finish school and come back to help you run the practice. She looked up at him with eyes red from crying. I thought I was protecting our family, Uncle Bob. I thought I was being smart. Bob walked to the window overlooking the pasture where Max was running, or rather patrolling. The dog's movements had become too precise, too calculated. He moved like a soldier, not a pet. How much, Sarah? $50,000 initially, $25,000 for each treatment phase. Her voice was hollow now. They said there would be more once the project was complete. Project complete. Bob repeated the word slowly. And what happens to Max then? Sarah's silence was answer enough. Bob closed his eyes, remembering Margaret's last words about Max being special, about how some creatures were meant for purposes bigger than themselves. She'd known somehow, maybe she'd even approved. But Bob couldn't shake the feeling that they'd traded Max's soul for temporary salvation. There's more, Sarah whispered. Dr. Wellington wants to breed him. He says Max's genetic modifications are stable enough to pass to offspring. They want to create a whole line of enhanced dogs. The image of Max as some kind of breeding machine, his puppies sold to the highest bidder or worse, used for purposes Bob didn't want to imagine, made him physically ill. He gripped the windowsill until his knuckles went white. When is Wellington coming back? Tomorrow, for the final evaluation before the breeding program begins. Sarah stood slowly, her legs unsteady. Uncle Bob, I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. When they first explained it, it sounded like we were helping advance veterinary medicine. Bob turned from the window, seeing his granddaughter clearly for the first time in months. She looked older, hollowed out by guilt and fear. But underneath the remorse, he saw the same girl who'd begged him to save every injured animal they'd ever encountered. She'd made a terrible choice from a place of love and desperation, just as he'd taught her. Family comes first, no matter the cost. Your grandmother would have made the same choice, he said, finally, watching relief flood Sarah's features. She always said that sometimes you have to make a deal with the devil to save the people you love. But even as he forgave her, Bob was already planning. Tomorrow, when Wellington came for his final evaluation, he'd find that some old soldiers still had fight left in them. The next morning brought an unseasonable chill to the Montana Valley, and Bob Carter woke before dawn with the same knot in his stomach he'd carried through 2 tours in Vietnam. Max lay beside his bed, alert and watchful, in a way that had become disturbingly familiar. The dog's enhanced senses seemed to pick up on Bob's anxiety, his massive head tilting as he studied his master's face with those unnaturally intelligent eyes. "Today's the day, old boy," Bob whispered, running his fingers through Max's thick coat. The dog's muscles rippled under his touch, dense and powerful in ways that defied nature. "We're going to find out what they really want with you." Sarah had been up most of the night, pacing the kitchen and making phone calls she thought Bob couldn't hear. Her hushed conversations leaked through the old farmhouse's thin walls, fragments of corporate speak mixed with what sounded like desperate negotiations. Bob had caught phrases like contract modification and subject withdrawal that made his blood run cold. Dr. Wellington arrived at precisely 9 o'clock, this time with a convoy of 3 black SUVs and a team of 8 people in matching polo shirts with a logo Bob didn't recognize. They moved with military precision, unloading equipment that looked more suited for a hospital operating room than a rural veterinary clinic. Bob watched from the kitchen window as they set up what appeared to be a mobile laboratory in his converted barn. Quite a production for a routine checkup, Bob commented when Wellington knocked on the front door. The younger man's smile seemed tighter today, more focused, and his handshake lingered a moment too long as he studied Bob's weathered features. "We're very excited about Max's progress," Wellington replied, his gaze shifting to where the German Shepherd sat perfectly still beside Bob's chair. "His response to the treatment has exceeded all our projections. We're ready to move to the next phase." Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. She'd dressed carefully in her best jeans and a button-down shirt that belonged to her grandmother, as if formal clothes could somehow legitimize what they were about to do. "Dr. Wellington, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about the breeding program." "Yes?" Wellington's attention sharpened, and Bob noticed how the man's posture changed, becoming more predatory. "I trust you've convinced Dr. Carter of the program's benefits?" "Actually," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "I think we need to discuss some modifications to the original agreement." Wellington's smile faltered slightly. "I'm afraid the contract is quite specific, Miss Carter. Max's enhanced genetics make him invaluable for research purposes." "The breeding program is essential for advancing canine medicine." Bob felt his temper rise at the casual way Wellington discussed Max like a piece of equipment. "And what exactly does this breeding program involve?" "Standard procedures," Wellington replied smoothly. "Max would be relocated to our Montana facility where he'd have access to premium care and selected female partners. The resulting offspring would be studied to determine if his enhancements are heritable." "Relocated." Bob repeated the word slowly. "You mean taken away?" "Temporarily. Perhaps 18 months to 2 years, depending on the success rate." Wellington consulted his tablet with the efficiency of a man discussing livestock. "Of course, the compensation would be substantial. An additional $200,000 plus ongoing royalties for each successful offspring." Sarah's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. $200,000 would solve all her financial problems and secure the ranch for another generation. Bob saw the calculation in her eyes, the same desperate math that had led her into this situation in the first place. "What guarantees do we have about Max's care?" Bob asked, though his military instincts were already providing uncomfortable answers. "Our facilities are state-of-the-art," Wellington assured him. "Max would receive the finest veterinary care available, regular health screenings, exercise programs, specialized nutrition. He'd be treated like the valuable asset he is." The word asset hung in the air like a curse. Bob looked at Max, who had remained motionless throughout the conversation, his intelligent eyes tracking every speaker with an awareness that no normal dog should possess. Whatever they'd done to him, Max seemed to understand exactly what was being discussed. "I'd like to see these facilities," Bob said finally, "before making any decisions." Wellington's tablet chimed and he glanced at it with apparent irritation. "I'm afraid that's not possible for security reasons, but I can show you photos and provide detailed documentation of our protocols." "Not good enough," Bob replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd learned to recognize deception in life-or-death situations. "If you want my dog, I see where he's going first." The standoff stretched for several uncomfortable seconds before Wellington's professional mask slipped slightly. "Dr. Carter, I understand your attachment to the animal, but we're talking about advancing veterinary science by decades. Max's genetic modifications could lead to treatments for dozens of diseases. Surely you can see the greater good here." "The greater good," Bob repeated. Funny how that phrase always seems to benefit the people with the most money and power. Sarah stepped forward, and Bob saw she'd made her decision. "Dr. Wellington, I think we need more time to consider your offer. This is a big decision for our family." Wellington's expression hardened. "Miss Carter, I should remind you that your contract includes specific performance clauses. Max's treatment was provided in exchange for your cooperation with our research program. If you're attempting to renegotiate now, are you threatening my granddaughter? Bob's voice dropped to the same tone he'd used when addressing hostile forces in Southeast Asia. Max responded to his master's anger by rising to his feet, and for the first time Wellington seemed to notice the dog's imposing size and enhanced musculature. "Of course not," Wellington backpedaled quickly. "I'm simply explaining the legal realities of the situation. Contracts must be honored." Bob walked to his desk and pulled out a manila folder he'd prepared the night before. "Speaking of legal realities, Doctor Wellington, I've been doing some research of my own." He slid a stack of documents across the table. "It seems your research company isn't licensed for animal experimentation in Montana. In fact, according to the State Veterinary Board, you're not even licensed to practice here." Wellington's face went white as he flipped through the pages. "These are administrative oversights, easily corrected." "Are they?" Bob pulled out another document. "Because according to this report from the Montana Department of Agriculture, unlicensed animal experimentation is a federal crime, punishable by up to 10 years in prison and seizure of all research assets." Sarah stared at her grandfather with newfound respect. While she'd been making deals with devils, Bob had been doing what he'd always done, gathering intelligence and preparing for battle. "Furthermore," Bob continued, "I've been in contact with the FBI's Animal Welfare Task Force. They're very interested in your company's methods of recruiting test subjects. Apparently, deliberately inducing cancer in healthy animals to create experimental subjects is considered animal cruelty under federal law." Wellington stood abruptly, his professional demeanor completely abandoned. "Dr. Carter, you don't understand what you're interfering with. This research has implications far beyond your simple rural practice. There are national security considerations." "National security?" Bob laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Son, I spent 2 years fighting for national security in Vietnam. I know what it looks like, and this isn't it. This is corporate greed dressed up in patriotic language." Through the window, Bob could see Wellington's team growing restless. They'd finished setting up their equipment and were clearly waiting for orders. Several of them had the bearing of former military, and Bob recognized the way they positioned themselves around the property. Not like medical technicians, but like soldiers preparing for conflict. "Sarah," Bob said quietly, not taking his eyes off Wellington, "I think you should call Sheriff Morrison. Tell him we have some uninvited guests who seem confused about property rights." "That won't be necessary," Wellington said quickly. "We're prepared to offer an alternative arrangement. Keep Max here, and we'll establish a research station on your property. You maintain custody, we conduct our studies. Everyone benefits." Bob considered the offer, knowing it was probably the best they'd get. But the thought of turning his family ranch into some kind of corporate laboratory made his stomach turn. "And if I refuse?" Wellington's mask slipped completely. "Then you'll discover that there are legal ways to acquire research assets when the public interest is at stake. Eminent domain has been successfully applied to animal subjects in cases involving national security." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Bob realized they'd moved far beyond simple contract disputes into territory where money and connections mattered more than right and wrong. He looked at Max, who seemed to understand every word being spoken, and saw his own determination reflected in the dog's unnaturally intelligent eyes. "Get off my property," Bob said quietly. "Take your equipment, your team, and your threats, and get off my land." Wellington gathered his papers with hands that shook slightly. "This isn't over, Dr. Carter. Max represents a significant investment, and investments must be protected." As the black SUVs drove away, Bob put his arm around Sarah's shoulders and felt her trembling with a mixture of relief and fear. They'd won this battle, but the war was just beginning. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Bob couldn't shake the feeling that Max's transformation was only the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous than any of them understood. 3 weeks after Wellington's threat, Bob's world exploded into chaos on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. He was feeding the chickens when Max began acting strangely, pacing the yard with an agitation Bob had never seen before. The dog's enhanced senses seemed to detect something approaching long before Bob's human ears caught the distant rumble of engines. The convoy that crested the hill wasn't subtle. 12 black vehicles moving in military formation, led by armored trucks that had no business on a rural Montana road. Bob's Vietnam instincts kicked in immediately. This wasn't a negotiation, it was an invasion. He whistled sharply for Max and ran toward the house, his 72-year-old legs moving faster than they had in years. "Sarah!" he shouted as he burst through the kitchen door. "We've got company and they're not here to talk." His granddaughter appeared from the living room, her face pale with recognition. She'd been expecting this, Bob realized with a sick feeling. The phone calls, the nervous pacing, the way she'd been watching the road, she'd known Wellington would come back with force. "Uncle Bob, I tried to call them off," she said, tears already streaming down her face. "I told them we'd negotiate, that we just needed time, but—" "But they never intended to negotiate," Bob finished grimly. Through the window he could see armed men in tactical gear emerging from the vehicles, surrounding the house with professional efficiency. These weren't corporate security guards. They were military contractors, the kind of men who asked questions later and never at all. Max positioned himself between Bob and the front door, his massive frame tense with protective instinct. The dog's training, whatever unholy combination of natural loyalty and artificial enhancement, had turned him into something between a guardian angel and a weapon of war. Bob placed his hand on Max's head, feeling the animal's controlled fury vibrating through his enlarged muscles. The first knock on the door was more of a demand than a request. "Dr. Carter, this is Federal Marshal Thompson. We have a warrant for the seizure of one German Shepherd designated as evidence in an ongoing federal investigation." Bob opened the door slowly, keeping Max behind him. The marshal was a thin man in his 50s with the dead eyes of someone who'd served too many warrants and asked too few questions. Behind him stood at least 20 armed men, their faces hidden behind tactical masks and their weapons clearly visible. "Let me see the warrant," Bob demanded, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. Thompson handed him a document thick with legal language and official seals. Bob's eyes scanned the text, his lawyer's training from night school 40 years ago still sharp enough to catch the important details. Unlawful possession of genetically modified biological material, potential threat to national security, immediate seizure authorized. "This is garbage," Bob said, handing the warrant back. "Max is my family pet, not government property." "That determination is no longer yours to make," Thompson replied with the mechanical politeness of a man following orders he didn't question. "The animal has been classified as a potential bioweapon. Federal law requires immediate containment and study." Sarah stepped forward, her veterinary training giving her courage. "Marshal Thompson, I'm a licensed veterinary student. This dog shows no signs of aggression or abnormal behavior. He's been living peacefully with my grandfather for months." "Ma'am, our scientists disagree." Thompson's tone suggested the conversation was over. "Step aside and surrender the animal, or we'll be forced to use sedation darts." Bob felt something snap inside him, the same protective fury that had carried him through jungle firefights and midnight emergency calls. "You want my dog? Come and take him." The standoff stretched for several heartbeats before Max made the decision for everyone. The dog stepped forward, placing himself directly between the armed men and his family, and released a sound that Bob had never heard before, part growl, part roar, entirely threatening. The enhanced vocal cords that Wellington's treatments had given him produced a noise that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Several of the tactical officers stepped backward involuntarily, their weapons rising despite their training. Bob saw fingers moving toward triggers and knew they'd reached the point of no return. "Easy, Max," Bob whispered, but his voice carried a different message. This was their home, their family, and some lines couldn't be crossed without consequences. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a natural disaster. Max's enhanced reflexes allowed him to move faster than any normal dog, covering the distance to the nearest officer in a bound that seemed to defy physics. The man's tranquilizer gun went flying as Max knocked him to the ground, but the dog's attack was controlled, precise, disabling rather than killing. The other officers opened fire immediately, but Max was already moving, his enhanced intelligence allowing him to anticipate their actions. He moved like liquid death, disarming 3 more men before their shots could find their mark. Bob watched in horrified fascination as his family pet became something between guardian angel and avenging demon. "Stand down," Thompson shouted, but his men were beyond listening. The sight of a dog moving with superhuman speed and intelligence had triggered every primal fear they'd tried to suppress through training and discipline. Sarah screamed as bullets began flying in earnest, shattering windows and splintering the wooden siding of the house that had sheltered 4 generations of Carters. Bob threw himself over his granddaughter, shielding her with his body as the firefight erupted around them. Max's enhanced capabilities kept him alive for almost 3 minutes against overwhelming odds. He moved through the armed men like a force of nature, never killing but systematically dismantling their ability to fight. Bob counted at least 8 officers down, their weapons scattered, their tactical formation completely broken. But even enhanced reflexes couldn't dodge bullets forever. Bob saw the moment when Max's luck ran out. A sniper's bullet from one of the armored vehicles, fired from a distance that even Max's speed couldn't overcome. The dog stumbled, dark blood spreading across his silver coat, and Bob's world shattered. "Max!" Sarah's scream cut through the gunfire like a blade. She tried to run to the wounded dog, but Bob held her back, knowing that the officers would shoot anything that moved. The big German shepherd staggered toward the house, his enhanced constitution keeping him upright despite wounds that would have killed a normal dog instantly. He made it to the porch steps before his legs gave out, collapsing in a spreading pool of blood that looked black against the painted wood. Bob crawled toward Max on his hands and knees, ignoring the shouts from the tactical team and the guns trained on his back. When he reached the dog, Max's eyes were still open, still aware, still focused on protecting his family, even as his life drained away. "Good boy," Bob whispered, his voice breaking as he cradled Max's massive head in his lap. "Good boy, Max. You did good." The dog's tail managed one weak thump against the porch boards, and his eyes found Bob's one last time. In that gaze, Bob saw forgiveness for what the treatments had done to him, gratitude for the years of love and care, and something else, a message he couldn't quite understand but knew he'd never forget. Max died as he'd lived, protecting the people he loved. Marshal Thompson approached cautiously, his weapon still drawn but no longer pointed at Bob. "Dr. Carter, I'm sorry for your loss, but the animal was classified as extremely dangerous. Our actions were justified under federal law." Bob looked up at the marshal with eyes that held 40 years of grief, for his wife, for his fallen comrades in Vietnam, for every animal he'd been unable to save, and now for the loyal companion who'd died defending his family. "Justified," he repeated quietly. "You murdered my dog in my own yard because your bosses were afraid of what they'd created." "Sir, the animal attacked federal officers. We had no choice." "You had every choice," Bob said, his voice gaining strength from righteous anger. You could have served your warrant properly. You could have negotiated. You could have shown basic human decency. Instead, you came to my home like an invading army and murdered the best friend I've ever had." Sarah knelt beside Bob, her hands gentle on Max's still form. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered apologies for the betrayal that had led to this moment. The guilt would stay with her forever, Bob knew, but that was a burden for another day. Thompson holstered his weapon and signaled for his team to stand down. "Dr. Carter, you and your granddaughter are free to go. Our investigation will continue, but you're no longer considered persons of interest." Bob continued stroking Max's fur, already growing cold in the mountain air. "Get off my property," he said without looking up. "All of you. Take your investigation and your federal authority and get out of my sight." As the convoy retreated down the hill, Bob and Sarah remained on the blood-stained porch with Max's body between them. The ranch felt impossibly quiet after the violence, as if the land itself was mourning the loss of its protector. The funeral for Max took place 3 days later in the small cemetery behind the Carter family chapel, a weathered wooden building that Bob's grandfather had constructed in 1925. Bob had insisted on burying Max with full honors, the way he would have honored any fallen soldier who died protecting his family. The local Methodist minister, Reverend Williams, agreed to officiate despite the unusual circumstances, understanding that grief recognizes no boundaries between human and animal love. Sarah stood beside the freshly dug grave, her eyes red from 3 days of constant weeping. She'd barely spoken since the shooting, communicating only in guilty whispers and self-recriminating silences. Bob watched his granddaughter destroying herself with remorse and felt his own heart breaking anew. He'd lost Max, but Sarah was disappearing into a darkness that threatened to swallow her entirely. "I killed him," she whispered for the 100th time as they lowered Max's body into the Montana earth. "Uncle Bob, I killed the best dog that ever lived for money I didn't even get to keep." Bob placed his weathered hand on Sarah's shoulder, feeling the tremors of grief that shook her thin frame. The truth was more complicated than her guilt would allow, but he understood the weight she carried. Every choice had consequences, and Sarah would live with hers for the rest of her life. "Your grandmother always said that guilt was a luxury we couldn't afford," Bob said quietly, his voice barely audible over the wind whistling through the pine trees. "Max died protecting us because that's who he was, enhanced or not. Don't dishonor his sacrifice by drowning in what might have been." The cemetery held 4 generations of Carters, their weathered headstones marking the passage of time in a landscape that seemed eternal. Bob's parents, his grandparents, and Margaret's grave with its simple inscription, "Beloved wife, mother, and friend to all creatures." Now Max would rest among them, the first non-human member of the family to earn such an honor. Reverend Williams spoke about loyalty, about the bond between man and beast that reflected divine love in its purest form. His words provided little comfort to Bob, who found himself questioning everything he'd believed about justice, family, and the price of love. They'd done everything right, protected the innocent, stood up to bullies, fought for what mattered, and still lost everything that made life worth living. The breaking point came that evening when Sarah collapsed in the kitchen, her body finally surrendering to the emotional trauma of the past weeks. Bob found her on the floor beside the table where Wellington had first presented his devil's bargain, her breathing shallow and her skin pale as Montana snow. "I can't do this anymore," Sarah gasped as Bob helped her to a chair. "I can't live with what I've done. I can't look at you knowing that I betrayed everything Grandma Margaret taught me about family loyalty." Bob knelt beside his granddaughter, seeing in her face the same despair that had consumed him after Margaret's death. The crushing weight of loss, the guilty certainty that different choices might have changed everything, the temptation to simply surrender to the darkness and let it swallow all the pain. "Sarah Elizabeth Carter," Bob said, using her full name the way her grandmother had during their most serious conversations. "You listen to me, and you listen good. You made a choice from a place of love and desperation. You thought you were saving Max's life and our family's future. That choice had consequences neither of us could have foreseen, but it came from the right place in your heart." "But the money was never about greed," Bob interrupted firmly. "You were drowning in debt, facing the loss of everything you'd worked for, watching me struggle to afford Max's care. You saw an opportunity to solve all our problems at once, and you took it. That's not betrayal, honey. That's what families do for each other, even when the choices turn out wrong." Sarah's tears came harder now, great racking sobs that seemed to tear something loose inside her chest. Bob held her the way he'd held her when she was 16 and lost, the way Margaret had held him through his own dark nights of the soul. Some pain had to be endured rather than cured, weathered rather than avoided. The phone rang at 10:30 that night, startling both of them from their vigil by the kitchen window. Bob almost didn't answer. Nothing good came from late-night calls, but something made him pick up on the fourth ring. "Dr. Carter?" The voice was unfamiliar, female, with the careful diction of someone choosing words precisely. "My name is Dr. Elizabeth Hayes." "I'm calling about Max." Bob's grip tightened on the receiver. "If you're with Wellington's company, you can go straight to—" "I'm not with Wellington," Dr. Hayes interrupted quickly. "I'm with the FBI's Animal Welfare Division. We've been investigating his operation for 6 months, and your case has blown it wide open. Dr. Carter, we need to talk." Bob looked at Sarah, who had gone rigid with attention. "About what?" "About justice for Max, and about the other dogs." Dr. Hayes paused significantly. "Dr. Carter, Max wasn't Wellington's only victim. We've identified at least 47 animals that have been subjected to similar experiments across 6 states. Some of them are still alive, still suffering in facilities we're working to locate." The implications hit Bob like a physical blow. Max's death hadn't been an isolated tragedy. It was part of a systematic program of animal abuse disguised as research. Somewhere out there, other dogs like Max were enduring the same transformation, the same separation from their families, the same ultimate fate. "What do you need from us?" Bob asked, his voice steadying as purpose replaced despair. "Your testimony, Sarah's documentation of the financial arrangements, most importantly, your willingness to help us understand exactly what Wellington's treatments did to Max." Dr. Hayes's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much cruelty disguised as progress. "Dr. Carter, your dog's enhanced capabilities were documented by our surveillance team during the raid. That evidence is crucial to proving the full scope of Wellington's crimes." Sarah was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white with tension. "Will it help the other dogs?" she asked, loud enough for Dr. Hayes to hear. "It might save them," came the reply. "Wellington's operation depends on secrecy and the isolation of his victims. If we can expose the full network, shut down the facilities, and prosecute everyone involved, we can prevent this from happening to other families." Bob felt something stirring in his chest, a familiar sensation from his military days when personal grief transformed into purposeful anger. Max was gone, but his death could still serve a greater purpose. The dog had died protecting his family. Now his memory could protect other families from the same nightmare. "Where do we meet?" Bob asked. 3 hours later, Bob and Sarah sat in a coffee shop in Helena, sharing their story with Dr. Hayes and FBI agent Michael Rodriguez. The federal agents recorded every detail from Sarah's initial contact with Wellington to Max's final moments on the porch. The telling was painful, but Bob found strength in the knowledge that each word brought justice closer. Dr. Carter, I need you to understand something, Dr. Hayes said as they concluded the interview. Wellington's program has powerful backers, people with money, connections, and the ability to make problems disappear. Taking them down won't be easy, and it won't be safe. Bob thought of Max's intelligent eyes, of the way the dog had positioned himself between danger and family, of the choice every man faced between comfort and conscience. Agent Hayes, I've lost everything that mattered to me except the chance to do right by Max's memory. You tell me what you need, and I'll give it to you. Sarah reached across the table and took her grandfather's hand. We'll give it to you, she corrected, her voice steady for the first time in days. As they drove home through the Montana darkness, Bob felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. Max was gone. The ranch felt empty, and the future remained uncertain. But they had purpose now, a mission that honored the loyalty Max had shown them. The dog had died protecting his family. Now his family would live protecting other dogs like him. The war was far from over, but for the first time since that terrible Tuesday morning, Bob Carter felt like himself again. The revelation came 18 hours later, delivered by Dr. Hayes in a phone call that shattered everything Bob thought he knew about Max's death. Sarah was feeding the chickens when the phone rang, trying to maintain some semblance of normal routine in the wake of their devastating loss. Bob answered on the second ring, expecting updates about the federal investigation. Dr. Carter, we need you to sit down, Dr. Hayes said without preamble. We've discovered something about the raid that changes everything. Bob's legs found the kitchen chair automatically, his body responding to the gravity in her voice. What kind of something? Max didn't die in that firefight. The words hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Our forensic team has been analyzing the scene, the blood samples, the tactical team's reports. Dr. Carter, the dog that was shot wasn't enhanced. It was a normal German shepherd, probably sedated and planted as a decoy. The kitchen seemed to tilt around Bob as his mind struggled to process the information. That's impossible. I held him. I watched him die. You held a dog that had been surgically altered to resemble Max, then shot to create the illusion of his death, Dr. Hayes continued relentlessly. The blood type doesn't match Max's samples from Wellington's files. The size and weight measurements are wrong. Most importantly, none of the enhanced musculature or bone density modifications were present. Bob's hand trembled as he gripped the phone. But why? Why stage his death? Because Wellington needed you to believe Max was gone so you'd stop fighting to get him back. Dr. Hayes paused, letting the implications sink in. Dr. Carter, Max is alive. He's being held at a research facility outside Billings, and according to our surveillance, he's not alone. Sarah burst through the kitchen door, her face flushed from running. She'd seen Bob's expression through the window and knew something monumental had happened. Uncle Bob, what is it? Bob covered the phone's mouthpiece. Max is alive. Sarah's coffee mug hit the floor with a crash that echoed through the suddenly electric silence. She stared at Bob with eyes that reflected hope and disbelief in equal measure. How is that possible? Dr. Hayes' voice crackled through the phone's speaker as Bob switched to hands-free mode. Miss Carter, we've been monitoring the Billings facility for 3 weeks. Your dog is being used as the primary breeding male for Wellington's enhanced canine program. He's been paired with 12 different females over the past month. The image of Max being used as a breeding machine, separated from his family and reduced to a tool for Wellington's ambitions, made Bob physically sick. His loyal companion, who had never shown interest in any female dog, was being forced to reproduce with strangers in service of some corporate nightmare. The good news, Dr. Hayes continued, is that we've identified the facility's location and security protocols. The bad news is that it's heavily guarded and legally protected under federal research guidelines. Wellington has convinced his government backers that Max represents a breakthrough in military working dog capabilities. Sarah sank into the chair across from Bob, her veterinary training helping her process the clinical horror of what Max was enduring. How many offspring? 17 puppies born so far, with more expected within the next few weeks. Doctor. Hayes's voice carried the weight of someone delivering unbearable news. Dr. Carter, Miss Carter, I need you to understand that Max's psychological condition is concerning. Our surveillance suggests he's been heavily sedated to ensure compliance. The dog you'll rescue may not be the same companion you remember. Bob felt rage building in his chest, the same cold fury that had carried him through combat zones and emergency surgeries. They'd taken Max's body, his freedom, his dignity, and now they were systematically destroying his spirit. Agent Hayes, what do you need from us to get him back? Officially, nothing. The FBI can't authorize a raid on a federally protected research facility without ironclad evidence of criminal activity. Dr. Hayes paused meaningfully. Unofficially, if concerned family members were to discover their pet's location and attempt a rescue, local law enforcement might be sympathetic to their cause. Sarah leaned toward the phone. Are you asking us to break the law? I'm telling you that Max is being held in Building C of the Billings Agricultural Research Center, that security shifts change at 6 a.m. and 10 p.m., and that the facility's perimeter fence has a maintenance gate on the north side that's been malfunctioning for 3 weeks. Dr. Hayes's tone suggested she was reading from notes she shouldn't possess. I'm also telling you that Agent Rodriguez will be conducting surveillance training exercises in the area tomorrow night, just in case any civilians need assistance. Bob and Sarah exchanged glances that carried 40 years of shared understanding. Margaret had always said that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the legal thing to do, and that family loyalty transcended bureaucratic boundaries. Max had spent his life protecting them. Now it was their turn to protect him. There's something else, Dr. Hayes added quietly. The other dogs in the facility. They're not all surviving the breeding program. Wellington's enhanced genetics seem to be unstable in second-generation offspring. We've documented at least 23 deaths among the puppies, and several of the female dogs have suffered complications that suggest systematic veterinary malpractice. The implications hit Bob like a physical blow. Max wasn't just being used, he was being tortured, forced to watch his offspring die while being powerless to protect them. The dog's enhanced intelligence would make him acutely aware of the suffering around him, creating a psychological hell that no animal should endure. When do we leave? Sarah asked, her voice steady with purpose. Bob looked at his granddaughter, seeing Margaret's determination in the set of her jaw and the fire in her eyes. Sarah had made terrible choices that led to this nightmare, but she was also the only person who understood Max's enhanced capabilities well enough to help rescue him safely. Tonight, Bob decided, we'll need supplies, transportation, and a plan for getting a traumatized, enhanced German Shepherd out of a federal facility without getting killed. Uncle Bob, Sarah said quietly, there's something I haven't told you about Max's enhancements, something Wellington made me promise to keep secret. Bob felt his stomach drop. What kind of something? The treatments didn't just enhance his physical capabilities and intelligence, they also increased his emotional sensitivity and memory retention. Sarah's voice grew smaller as she continued. Max remembers everything that's happened to him with perfect clarity. Every injection, every separation, every moment of pain or fear. Wellington said it was a side effect they couldn't eliminate. The true horror of Max's situation crashed over Bob like a cold wave. His loyal companion wasn't just physically imprisoned, he was mentally trapped in every traumatic moment of the past months, unable to forget or heal from any of it. The dog's enhanced mind had become a prison of perfect, inescapable memory. "Then we get him out tonight," Bob said with quiet finality. "Whatever it takes, however dangerous it is, we bring him home." Dr. Hayes's voice softened with something that might have been admiration. "Dr. Carter, Miss Carter, I want you to know that what you're planning is incredibly dangerous. Wellington has private security contractors guarding that facility, and they're authorized to use lethal force against intruders." "Agent Hayes," Bob replied, "I've been dangerous longer than those boys have been alive. And I've got something they don't." "What's that?" Bob looked at the empty dog bed by the fireplace, at the food bowls still sitting by the kitchen door, at the countless reminders of the loyal companion who'd shared his life for 8 years. "I've got a promise to keep to the best friend I've ever had." As evening fell over the Montana Valley, Bob and Sarah began their preparations for a mission that would either reunite them with Max or cost them everything they had left. The old soldier in Bob recognized the familiar weight of choosing duty over safety, while Sarah channeled her guilt into determined action. They were going to bring Max home or die trying. Some bonds were worth any risk, and some promises demanded everything you had to give. Tonight, they would discover which kind of people they really were when everything else was stripped away. The rescue mission began at 11 p.m., with Bob driving his old Ford pickup through the back roads toward Billings, Sarah beside him clutching a veterinary sedation kit and a thermos of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The Montana night stretched endlessly around them, punctuated only by the distant lights of farmhouses and the occasional flash of deer eyes in the headlight beams. Bob's hands were steady on the wheel, but Sarah could see the tension in his jaw, the way his military training was reasserting itself after decades of civilian life. "Tell me about the layout again," Bob said as they crested a hill that brought the research facility into view. The Billings Agricultural Research Center sprawled across 50 acres of fenced prairie, its buildings stark and industrial against the star-filled sky. Security lights created pools of harsh illumination that made the shadows between them seem impenetrable. "Building C is the third structure from the north fence," Sarah recited, consulting the hand-drawn map Dr. Hayes had provided. "Max should be in the large holding area on the ground floor. The breeding females are kept in separate kennels on the second floor." Her voice caught slightly. "Uncle Bob, what if he doesn't remember us? What if the treatments and trauma have changed him too much?" Bob pulled the truck off the main road onto a dirt track that led toward the facility's north perimeter. "Then we remind him who he is. Dogs don't forget love, Sarah. Enhanced or not, Max knows we're his family." They parked a quarter-mile from the fence, hidden behind a stand of cottonwood trees that provided cover from the roving security patrols. Bob checked his watch. 10:47 p.m. 13 minutes until the shift change Dr. Hayes had mentioned. They moved through the darkness with practiced quiet, Sarah following her grandfather's lead as he navigated toward the malfunctioning maintenance gate. The fence was 12 feet of chain link topped with razor wire, but the maintenance gate hung slightly ajar, its electronic lock displaying a steady red error light. Bob tested the opening carefully, finding just enough space for them to squeeze through without triggering additional alarms. His Vietnam experience had taught him that sometimes the best security was the kind that looked accidental. Building C loomed ahead of them, a concrete structure that seemed designed to contain rather than house whatever lived inside. Through the ground floor windows they could see rows of large kennels, most of them occupied by shapes that moved restlessly in the dim emergency lighting. The sound that reached their ears made Sarah's blood run cold, dozens of dogs whimpering, pacing, some howling with a desperation that spoke of prolonged captivity. "There," Bob whispered, pointing toward a kennel in the center of the building. Even in the poor light, Max's distinctive silhouette was unmistakable. The German shepherd sat perfectly still, unnaturally rigid, his enhanced musculature making him appear larger and more imposing than any normal dog. But something was wrong with his posture, a defeated quality that Bob had never seen in his proud companion. Sarah pulled out her veterinary tools, preparing sedatives for the other dogs who might panic during the rescue. "Uncle Bob, look at the females on the second floor." She pointed toward windows where they could see smaller shapes moving behind bars. "Some of them look pregnant. What do we do about Max's offspring?" Bob studied the building, his mind calculating routes, timing, and complications. "We save who we can, but Max comes first. Those puppies deserve a chance, but we can't help them if we're dead or captured." They approached Building C from the blind spot Agent Rodriguez had identified, using a service door that opened with a key card Dr. Hayes had somehow obtained. The interior smelled of antiseptic and fear, a clinical environment that made Bob's skin crawl. The dogs' agitation increased as they detected human presence, but their barking was strangely muted. Sedatives, Bob realized, designed to keep them compliant. Max's kennel was the largest in the facility, reinforced with steel bars that looked capable of containing something far more dangerous than a dog. When Bob approached, Max's head lifted slowly, his enhanced eyes reflecting the emergency lighting with an eerie intelligence. For a moment, Bob feared Sarah's worst nightmare had come true, that Max no longer recognized them. Then Max's tail gave a single, tentative wag. "Easy, boy," Bob whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he worked on the kennel's electronic lock. "We're here. We're taking you home." Max rose unsteadily, his movements revealing the physical toll of months in captivity. His enhanced musculature had atrophied from lack of exercise, and Bob could see injection sites covering his body where Wellington's team had maintained their chemical control. The dog approached the kennel door slowly, as if afraid this might be another cruel test. Sarah had the door open within minutes, her veterinary training helpful for understanding the facility's security systems. When Max finally emerged from his prison, he didn't run to them immediately. Instead, he stood in the center of the room, looking around at the other captive dogs with an expression that Bob could only describe as profound guilt. "He knows they can't all come with us," Sarah realized, tears streaming down her face. "He understands that we're leaving the others behind." Max made his choice then, walking directly to Bob and pressing his massive head against his master's chest. The gesture was exactly the same as it had been 8 years ago when Bob first brought him home from the shelter, a silent communication of trust and belonging that transcended words. "Good boy," Bob whispered, running his hands through Max's familiar coat. "We're going home, Max. All of us." But even as they prepared to leave, Bob couldn't ignore the sounds from the other kennels. Pregnant females whimpering in distress, puppies crying for mothers who might not survive the night, adult dogs who'd been subjected to the same treatments as Max, but without his mental resilience. The scope of Wellington's cruelty was breathtaking. "Uncle Bob," Sarah said urgently, "we can't leave them all." Bob looked at his granddaughter, seeing Margaret's compassion burning in her eyes, and made a decision that probably violated every rule of tactical extraction. "Then we don't." The next 20 minutes became a controlled frenzy of liberation. Bob and Sarah moved through the facility systematically, opening every kennel they could access, releasing dozens of dogs into the Montana night. Most fled immediately, their survival instincts overriding months of conditioning. But several of the pregnant females stayed close to Max, as if recognizing him as their protector. They were loading the last of the dogs into the pickup when the security alarms finally triggered. Floodlights blazed across the compound as armed guards emerged from their stations, but Agent Rodriguez's training exercise had positioned FBI vehicles at strategic points around the perimeter. The resulting confusion bought them precious minutes to escape. Bob drove through the darkness with 13 dogs in the truck bed and Max beside him in the cab, his loyal companion finally allowing himself to relax as they put distance between themselves and the nightmare facility. Sarah rode in the back, providing comfort to the traumatized females and trying to assess which ones needed immediate veterinary care. "Where do we take them?" Sarah asked through the rear window. Bob considered their options, knowing that their ranch couldn't accommodate this many animals and that Wellington's people would be looking for them within hours. Then he remembered Dr. Hayes's final piece of information. The FBI had been quietly coordinating with animal rescue organizations across the region, preparing for exactly this scenario. "We take them to people who understand that some battles are worth fighting," Bob replied, pulling out his phone to call the emergency number Dr. Hayes had provided. As they drove through the Montana dawn with their rescued family, Bob felt something he hadn't experienced since Max's supposed death: hope. They'd kept their promise to the loyal companion who'd never broken faith with them. They'd struck a blow against the kind of systematic cruelty that treated living beings as disposable assets. Most importantly, they'd proven that love and loyalty could triumph over money and power when people were willing to risk everything for what mattered most. Max was home. Sarah had found her redemption, and together they'd saved dozens of innocent lives. The war against Wellington wasn't over, but they'd won the battle that counted most. 6 months after the rescue, Bob Carter stood on his front porch watching Max play with 3 of his offspring in the Montana sunshine, and felt the kind of deep contentment that comes only after surviving life's hardest tests. The German Shepherd had regained his strength and spirit, though the enhanced intelligence remained, a permanent reminder of their ordeal that had transformed from curse to blessing. Max seemed to understand that his unusual abilities came with responsibility, and he'd appointed himself guardian not just of the Carter Ranch, but of every rescued dog that had found sanctuary there. Sarah emerged from the converted barn that now served as their rehabilitation center, her veterinary degree finally complete thanks to a scholarship from the Animal Welfare Foundation. She'd testified before Congress about Wellington's crimes, her courage in exposing the truth transforming her from accomplice to hero. The guilt would always be part of her story, but it had become fuel for a lifetime of advocacy rather than a weight that crushed her spirit. "Dr. Hayes called," Sarah announced, settling beside Bob on the porch swing that Margaret had loved. "Wellington's sentencing is next week. They're expecting 15 to 20 years for animal cruelty, fraud, and conspiracy." Bob nodded, feeling satisfaction rather than vindication. Justice had been served, but more importantly, it had prevented other families from enduring what they'd experienced. The Billings facility had been shut down permanently, its remaining animals relocated to sanctuaries across the country. Wellington's government backers had quietly distanced themselves from the program, claiming ignorance of the illegal methods used. "And the good news," Sarah continued with a smile that reminded Bob powerfully of her grandmother, "is that 12 more families have agreed to adopt our rescues. Max's babies are going to have real homes." The rescue operation had evolved into something neither Bob nor Sarah had anticipated. Word spread through the tight-knit community of animal lovers about the dogs that needed special care, and applications poured in from families across the region. Each adoption was carefully screened, with lifetime support provided through the Carter Ranch Sanctuary, a nonprofit organization that Sarah had established with help from Dr. Hayes and the FBI's seized assets from Wellington's operation. Max lifted his head from where he'd been supervising his offspring's play, his enhanced senses detecting something before Bob's human awareness caught up. A familiar sound reached them, the rumble of a school bus making its way down the country road. But this wasn't the same yellow bus that had once brought neighborhood children past their ranch. This was a smaller vehicle painted in cheerful colors, filled with special visitors who'd been coming every Wednesday for the past 3 months. "Therapy Day," Bob said with warm anticipation. The partnership with Helena's senior care facility had been Sarah's idea, born from watching how Max's presence seemed to heal not just physical ailments but emotional wounds. The enhanced dog had an intuitive understanding of human pain that made him an exceptional therapy animal. As the bus parked near the house, elderly passengers began emerging with the careful movements of people for whom every step mattered. Bob recognized most of them now: veterans dealing with PTSD, widows struggling with loneliness, individuals whose families had forgotten them in the rush of modern life. They came to the ranch seeking connection with creatures who offered unconditional love without judgment or expectation. "There's my Max," called Eleanor Patterson, an 83-year-old former teacher whose arthritis made walking difficult, but whose face lit up whenever she saw the German Shepherd. Max approached her with the careful gentleness that characterized all his interactions with vulnerable humans, allowing her to lean on his strong frame as they made their way to the shaded area where therapy sessions took place. Bob watched the scene unfold with wonder that never diminished. Max seemed to understand exactly what each visitor needed: energetic play for those dealing with depression, calm presence for those managing anxiety, protective alertness for those haunted by trauma. The dog's enhanced capabilities had found their true purpose not in military applications or corporate profits, but in healing human hearts. "You know what I think?" Sarah asked, observing the same scene with professional fascination. "I think Max was always meant to be extraordinary. The treatments just revealed abilities that were already part of who he was." Dr. Rodriguez, the FBI agent who'd become a friend during the investigation, approached from where he'd been photographing the therapy session for a federal report on animal-assisted healing programs. "Dr. Carter, Miss Carter, I have news that might interest you. The Department of Justice is considering a new initiative based on your work here, using rescued animals in therapeutic settings as an alternative to traditional punishment for animal abuse cases." Bob felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with personal accomplishment and everything to do with legacy. Margaret had always believed that their purpose in life was to leave the world better than they'd found it. The Carter Ranch Sanctuary was becoming exactly that kind of positive force, a place where damaged creatures healed each other and where the community gathered to remember what really mattered. "There's something else," Dr. Rodriguez continued, his expression growing more serious. "We've identified 3 other facilities similar to Wellington's operation. The techniques you developed for rescuing and rehabilitating enhanced animals are going to be crucial for shutting them down." Sarah leaned forward with interest. "Are you asking us to help with more rescues?" "I'm asking if you'd consider making this work your full-time mission," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "The Animal Welfare Foundation has approved funding for a mobile rescue unit based out of your ranch. You'd be the first response team for cases involving experimental or enhanced animals." Bob looked at Max, who had settled beside Eleanor Patterson and was allowing 3 other elderly visitors to pet him simultaneously. The dog's contentment was obvious. This was where he belonged, doing work that mattered with people who loved him. It was the life Wellington's experiments had accidentally made possible, though for purposes the corporate scientist had never intended. "What would that mean for our therapy program?" Bob asked. "It would expand it," Dr. Rodriguez assured him. "Every animal you rescue would become part of the therapeutic community once they'd healed enough to help others. You'd be creating a network of sanctuaries across the region, all connected by the principle that damaged creatures can learn to trust and love again." Sarah's eyes were bright with possibility. "Uncle Bob, we could help hundreds of animals and thousands of people. We could make sure what happened to Max never happens to another family." Bob considered the offer, thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. Wellington's greed had led to Max's enhancement, which had created the bond that motivated their rescue mission, which had exposed the larger conspiracy, which had led to this opportunity to help others. Margaret used to say that God worked in mysterious ways, turning even the worst situations into opportunities for grace. "Max," Bob called softly. The German shepherd lifted his head. Those unnaturally intelligent eyes focused on his master with complete attention. "What do you think, old boy? Ready to help some more friends?" Max's tail began wagging with the slow, deliberate rhythm that Bob recognized as his deepest contentment. The dog understood the question and approved of the answer they were all moving toward. "We'll do it," Bob decided, feeling the rightness of the choice settle in his chest like warmth from a fireplace. "But we do it as a family, Max, Sarah, and all the dogs we've rescued. We stick together." Dr. Rodriguez smiled, extending his hand to seal the agreement. "Welcome to the Animal Rescue Task Force, Dr. Carter. I think you're going to change a lot of lives." As evening fell over the Montana ranch, Bob sat on his porch with Max beside him, watching Sarah lead a group of visitors in feeding the rescued dogs. The sight filled him with the kind of peace that comes from knowing your life has meaning beyond personal happiness. They'd found their purpose in protecting the innocent, healing the damaged, and building bridges between species that reminded everyone involved of their capacity for love. Max pressed his head against Bob's hand, and in that familiar gesture of trust and devotion, Bob heard an echo of Margaret's voice reminding him that home wasn't a place. It was wherever your family gathered to do the work that mattered most. Finding purpose after loss can transform our deepest pain into our greatest contribution. Like Bob and Sarah, many of us discover that our most meaningful chapters begin when we choose to protect and heal others who've experienced trauma similar to our own. Whether it's caring for rescued animals, mentoring younger generations, or advocating for those without voices, our accumulated wisdom and compassion become powerful tools for creating positive change. The loyalty and unconditional love we've experienced, from pets, family, or friends, teaches us that true fulfillment comes not from what we receive, but from what we give to those who need our protection and guidance. What experience in your life taught you the most about loyalty and unconditional love? Have you ever found unexpected purpose in helping others heal from challenges you've faced yourself? Share your story in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.